Yo! I'm Chucky Prophet, and welcome to my long-awaited DMC3 review. It's one of my favorite games of all time, so Oh no. Oh no, 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 no. Welcome to my Devil May Cry 2 review, gentlemen. And yeah, it's bad. How bad, you ask? Well, let's find out together as we embark on my Devil May Cry 2 review.
That's just a piece of crap.
Okay, so before we begin, it's important to understand the circumstances that surrounded Devil May Cry 2 and its troubled development. Others have covered this topic in far better detail than I can, and I'll link those videos below, but TLDR. Two main issues practically buried Devil May Cry 2 before it could even release. Firstly, Capcom was so confident in DMC1's success that they greenlit a sequel before the first game had even finished being made. This of course meant that the team that worked on Devil May Cry 2 had no idea of how the first game was even going to be received, and what would work and what wouldn't. This would lead to many key aspects of Devil May Cry 1, such as Dante's humorous side being discarded because the developers just didn't think they would work, and by the time they did get this crucial feedback, the game would be way too far through development to stop and build it up again from the ground up, leaving the game in the hands of a team who'd previously mainly worked on arcade titles, and it's that key mistake that acted as a catalyst for Devil May Cry 2's myriad issues. On release, Devil May Cry 2's main marketed selling point was its two campaigns, split between two discs, allowing you to play as Dante and a brand new character, Lucia, separately. Playing each of these characters is at least uniquely miserable, as both have crippling issues that render their gameplay at most boring and at worst brain-burstingly boring. Dante loses all of his mobility, and his iconic stinger feels incredibly sluggish, barely covering any distance. On top of that, his entire combo list from Devil May Cry 1 has been gutted, and he now has about 3 moves, all of which are genuinely less effective than just spamming his basic attack, or, more infamously, his guns, which not only do insane damage, but can very easily stun and knock back most enemy types, allowing you to beat almost anything with just Ebony and Ivory and enough patience. Dante's sword swings also knock enemies back ridiculously far, severely reducing the tension in most fights pre-Dante Must Die difficulty, and making it frustrating to combo anything. All of these changes, as I understand it, were meant to make the game more accessible for newer players, but just ended up destroying the game's core supposed gameplay loop, of demolishing enemies as quickly and stylishly as possible. Instead, playing Dante can be experienced as a miserable slog, spamming the same 3 attacks over and over until something eventually stops moving, or as a trivialized third-person shooter that allows you to beat the game while only holding one button. Lucia is clearly meant to differentiate herself from Dante by stealing his speed and maneuverability and trading it for attack range, as she makes use of 2 much smaller daggers. Once again, her campaign can also be trivialized by holding down the shoot button, but beyond that, none of her combos have actually been thought out, and are so poorly differentiated from her basic attacks I wasn't even sure if she had any. And to top it all off, Devil Trigger is also still the only way to get meaningful damage done now, except it generally lasts far longer, so even more combat encounters boil down to grinding to get Devil Trigger and then finishing off whatever tanky enemies remain with it. Despite this, however, Devil May Cry 2 does actually have a handful of redeemable design decisions that make combat remotely bearable, and would go on to become mainstays of the series at large. Firstly, there's the dedicated wall running and dodge button, which is much more easily accessible than in the first game. This allows you to actually respond to an enemy's attacks instead of frantically jumping out of the way. The game also allowed you to switch weapons on the fly, which normally would allow for a massive variety in combos and tons of new options in combat, if it wasn't for one key problem. There are no unique melee weapons, just slightly different versions of the same thing. Instead of getting any cool or unique weapons, Dante just gets 3 almost identical swords, which apparently have different levels of speed, power, and reach respectively. The difference is barely noticeable, and the same goes for Lucia. Ranged weapons are a bit better differentiated, but both Dante and Lucia have no incentive to switch off their basic ranged option, as it's easily their best one. Even the progression system is a significant downgrade from the first game, as instead of progressing by slowly accumulating new moves and combos over the course of the game by buying them with red orbs, you now progress by leveling up your weapons in individually, giving them a boring flat damage upgrade at exorbitant red orb prices. I understand most of the decisions made during the design process for this game considering the time crunch that devs experienced, but this is baffling to me. The player has any tangible sense of progression stripped away. No more stylish and fun new moves, just boring and barely noticeable stats upgrades. With there being no differently themed elemental weapons anymore, DT also doesn't change based on weapon equipped. Instead, Devil Trigger's properties are based on gems that can be socketed into an amulet to produce varying effects. There are 3 main slots: an elemental damage slot consisting of lightning, fire, and ice gems that should theoretically all do differing amounts of damage to enemies based on elemental compatibility. It barely ever seems to matter though. There are also options to maximize DT's healing or damage, or trade both of those out for a small time stop every hit, and a weird utility slot which allows Devil Trigger to fly, run faster, or swim better. Yes, the water levels are back. Woo! This system could be interesting if anything was done with it, as customizing your Devil Trigger to deal with certain encounters could allow for a really nuanced approach to combat. But instead, there's no reason to switch off the basic heart combination except for very specific scenarios and bosses, as most enemies don't really seem to have any elemental affinity beyond those that are blatantly obvious. Once again, this variation in your approach to combat can be seen making a return later in the series, albeit through the much improved stance system. Health and Devil Trigger meter progression also work similarly to Devil May Cry 1, by collecting blue orb fragments and by buying blue and purple orbs from the store. However, now blue orb fragments are placed in much more obvious locations, with some still being fairly well hidden, which I approve of as a change overall. It just means that upgrading your character's health isn't hidden behind a wall of poorly placed items, while still keeping some challenge in collecting all of them. All the problems with the gameplay are then only made even worse by the really lackluster level design. They're just way too big, so you spend more time running around this ugly, empty expanse than you do actually playing. And when you do get into a combat encounter, all of the arenas are usually way too large to house the enemies within them, so there's way too much room for you to just sit back and shoot with your guns. Any sense of urgency or tension is then robbed from the combat. On top of that, none of them have any depth, like branching pathways or hidden secrets to find, so trudging through them is just incredibly boring, and there's barely anything to actually do. Secret missions are now even more weirdly placed. Devil May Cry 1's secret missions were at least placed in locations that stood out visually in some way, whereas these are all placed inside random walls and doors that you wouldn't even notice. Devil May Cry 1 levels had this great feeling of interconnectedness, and even if missions were short, it was fun to revisit older areas of the castle that had changed dramatically from the last time you saw them. Meanwhile, Devil May Cry 2 areas are barely linked at all, either by story logic or as part of a bigger world. For instance, you can head through a door and instantly go from small seaside town to full-on residential area without even a cutscene. Oh, and yeah, underwater levels back, and they somehow control even worse now, so have fun trying to position yourself in the water and, you know, hit switches. Because of course, why wouldn't I have to hit switches underwater? Nothing more fun. And as if it all wasn't bad enough, Devil May Cry 2 enemy design is also legendarily bad. You're lucky if they even have attacks, and the attacks they do have are usually only ranged attacks that interrupt a combo, and are never used again. This would be fine if you could at least kill them quickly like in something like Dynasty Warriors, but all of them are also incredibly tanky for no reason. Combine this with the lack of any combo variety and the game is just a massive slog no matter how you choose to play it. Oh, but don't worry, at least there's the bosses, right? Ignoring those two abominations against God, since it's pretty fucking obvious how much of a travesty they are, yeah, pretty much every boss in this game just spams attacks at range, and you either have to wait to get near it or wait for some kind of vulnerable opening to attack them. This just completely destroys any chance you have of being able to have fun playing the game at all during these fights. What makes it even worse is that then there's this weird duo of bosses that actually feel kind of competently designed. Volvuk and Despair are both decent, fast-paced boss fights with some interesting ideas that could be fun in another Devil May Cry game. Put it this way, these fights are set at Devil May Cry 3 pacing, so your character is just way slower than they are, which of course makes fighting them miserable as they just do everything faster than you do. And that's without mentioning the fact that Despair can randomly teleport behind you, which completely breaks the shitty lock-on system and makes your camera whiz around you 7 times before you can actually do anything. Which of course leads me to talking about the game's difficulty. it's a mess. The original idea was to have Devil May Cry 2 be a far easier experience than Devil May Cry 1 overall, as the developers felt that the first game's harder difficulty was off-putting for potential players. So that's why 90% of this game can be trivialized by holding down your chosen gun button, as well as why combos have been all but removed from the experience. Higher difficulty modes change this by making everything tankier. So it doesn't do much more damage, it just takes you longer to kill things. So now combat gets to be even more miserable. Then there are the bosses who just spam projectiles quicker than you can effectively dodge, fill the room with ads, or abuse the game's shitty lock-on system to whittle you down and kill you. Genuinely, playing this game on Must Die difficulty is one of the most miserable experiences I've had in recent times. It's not even that hard, just frustrating. I only died around 8 times overall over my 5 or 6 playthroughs of the game, and those were all either due to camera bullshit or the damn invisible fish. Yay, underwater levels, so glad they're back. Because of the way this difficulty is expressed, there's also no real incentive to get better at the game, just to keep playing it the way you have been. I may have issues with the first game's enemy and boss design, but at least I became tangibly better at the game by the end, through learning the game's combat and the strategies to beat its boss lineup. There's nothing like that in 2, and honestly I think that's its biggest failure, both as a sequel to the original and as a game in general.
My dream! My life! I was going to be the king of this world!
King? Yeah. Here's your crown.
Yeah, so, the story. Dante is in a place called Vida Mali, for some reason, and gets contracted by a random woman and her grandma to go beat up Mr. Business, CEO of Big Business himself. There's barely any connective tissue between the events and the stories. The next plot beat we get is Dante running into Big Businessman on an oil rig, and then they do nothing but talk. Then they fight again in an office, and the big bad demon running everything is revealed halfway into the game, without being so much as mentioned before. Anyway, Dante misses an incredibly easy opportunity to beat the big bad because we need more playtime, and then we get maybe like 5 or 6 missions before a final confrontation with Mr. Business, where Dante kills him and then kills Big Demon, which results in him being stuck in hell. As you might have surmised, Dante's story is incredibly poorly handled. Events have barely any connective tissue between them, so there is literally no context or understanding for why plot events happen. Things just sort of do. Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. Things just occur in the plot until they stop. Which is a shame, because I think the idea of a corrupt businessman being the one to bring demons into the world is an interesting enough idea, and could make for a pretty fun story with the right execution. But this isn't it. But because of the split between Dante and Lucia's campaigns, there's also the opportunity to see things from Lucia's perspective. She has a much bigger personal connection with the main villain, and much more interesting stakes in the overall story. But Dante's campaign only lets you experience fragments of that, and at the end of her development too. So without the context of the Lucia campaign, she just seems like an incredibly bizarre and out-of-place character. The Lucia campaign is a bit better by comparison, as at least there's somewhat of a plot to follow, that being Lucia's journey of sort of self-discovery. It's still all very basically written, but at least it's functional. Or at least it would be if it wasn't punctuated with dialogue like,
I was created by Arius. I could become a monster and attack the humans at any time!
But in an overarching sense, the story is just sort of Devil May Cry 1 again, but worse. Dante is invited to a place by a female character who turns out to be a puppet of the antagonist, and the story centers around Dante helping that woman find her humanity. Lucia is admittedly actually better written than Triss, although marginally, as you can actually track her development over the course of the game if you play her campaign. But that requires you to actually want to pick her campaign up, and if I weren't doing this review, I never would have. She's still, unfortunately, exactly like Trish, a personalityless blob that trots around the game without any interesting interaction with anything within the world. Dante, as previously mentioned, has no reason to be here either, and without the whole Trish mother thing, he has no emotional investment in this story whatsoever. Oh, but don't worry, we disintegrated his entire personality so he just seems fucking tired in every cutscene. He wants to be there less than I do, for real. As for the main villain, Mr. Businessman Arius' back must ache from hard carrying the entire game like Sisyphus. I do love my silly Power Rangers level goofy villains, and it doesn't really feel like the story is trying to make me take this thing seriously, so I'm fine with him being like this. I just wish that Argosax was an actual part of the game so there could be at least some threat for the characters to face, as Arius definitely isn't it.
A false coin for a false god.
Yeah, somehow this game manages to look significantly worse than its predecessor in almost every possible respect, a fact best demonstrated through the quality of the fight with Phantom compared to the first game. All of his animations look far worse than before, and the variety of tells he would use to fairly communicate what attack he was about to do to the player have been stripped. Even the model somehow looks worse, despite essentially being a direct asset flip from the previous game. This problem is especially noticeable in the environments, which, because they're too large for their own good, all look incredibly drab and devoid of detail. Every crevice of Devil May Cry 1's castle was incredibly thoughtfully put together, and created this really heavy and mysterious atmosphere that, despite clashing with some aspects of the game's tone, was really impressive. By comparison, Devil May Cry 2 maps are devoid of detail entirely, with flat textures being stretched over vast backgrounds, with no unique flair or sense of purpose behind them whatsoever. This isn't helped only by the completely dull color palette where almost every area is saturated by dry, muted tones that drain what little life or atmosphere there was left in the game. However, the actual character and enemy designs used in the game are, on the whole, pretty decent. Dante's design in this game in particular is one that a lot of people look back on fondly, but I gotta disagree. The weird black part in his coat just kind of throws the whole design off for me, but that's kind of a personal taste issue. To be fair, I would say the new design suits an edgier and more mature Dante, especially because of the black thrown in, but nah, it's just kind of ugly to me. Lucia, though, is visually really fucking cool, and it's a shame she will be forever confined to this game. Her Devil Trigger design is really fun and visually separates itself from Dante really nicely, especially with all the angel theming, as well as it incorporating a character's base design into their Devil Trigger form, easily the best of any DT form in the series. Like how the flowing shape language of her cape is used to form a base for her angelic white wings in Devil Trigger, as well as her black crop top mimicking her skin. If Lucia was an actual character, I'm sure I could find some way this design was linked in a really cool way to that as well, but unfortunately she isn't. Meanwhile, supporting characters like Arius and Lucia's grandma look entirely as you'd expect them to, which is fine, minus Arius' stupid fucking king robe. As for enemy and boss designs, they're actually pretty good on the whole. Like, ignoring their shitty AI, this game does have some inventive and unique enemies, like the fucking torture cage dudes or the goat man, but even those are dragged down by some absolute stinkers, like the boring wizard dudes that have 3 whole fucking meaningless palette swabs that are fought the exact same way and look just as visually dead as the others, and that's without getting into the monkeys. Ignoring obvious offenders, the boss lineup at least looks like it should be exciting to fight, especially the weird and fun looking entries like Yokatgul or First Stage Argosax. Spoiler, they are not fun, please don't play this game. The 2 main praiseworthy designs I can pick out are probably those of Bulwark and Furiataurus. Bulwark gets bonus points for hopefully being a Skull Knight reference, and also just having this really imposing and fun design that actually made me excited to fight him when he first showed up, but that didn't pay off very well. As for Furiataurus, he's just a very well executed and fun demon design to me, but also looks graphically the best of any of the bosses in Devil May Cry 2's roster in my opinion, but maybe that's just all the fire obscuring how shitty he looks underneath. I'd love to be able to say something here about the soundtrack, but I can't, because it's perfectly okay and functional, and even after attempting to listen to it while scripting this video, I could not give a single song that stood out to me as either bad or good. This is another large point of praise people seem to have for this game, and I don't hugely get why. Like, the battle theme is decent, but it doesn't go nearly as hard as Public Enemy. There are a few decent atmospheric pieces of what is supposed to be the emotional climaxes, but none of it really made me go monkey brain. However, that's likely just my silly personal taste, and I am glad people can at least find something to appreciate about this game, even if it is just the soundtrack. As for the actual sound designs, it's as grating and unpleasant as you might expect. We've got some real stinkers in here, from the constant hum of infested tank making me want to blow my brains out even more than fighting him, to the monkey noises and interesting aria scream. There's plenty of evidence for me to say that it's possibly got the worst sound design of any game I've ever played.
Good grief. They really made a big mess, didn't they?
Devil May Cry 2 was obviously kind of just the product of a massive logistical fuck-up by Capcom, and while obviously care and passion was put into the project at some level, it still resulted in one of the worst video games I've ever played, if not the worst. And yet there are still the die-hard contrarians that defend it. But you know what? I can respect the sheer unwillingness to accept reality in favor of believing in the version of this game that could have been. It genuinely is very disappointing, especially since large portions of the team that made this game would later go on to create Devil May Cry 3. So it did have the potential to work, but Capcom's fundamental mishandling of the project bungled it for everyone. Regardless, after deciding to platinum the entire game out of pure spite for myself, and honestly I wanted to see a funny line of platinum trophies under my DMC HD collection icon on PS, I can confirm that this is in fact the certified stinker everyone says it is, and you should steer fully clear of it if playing through the series. Honestly though, with Capcom revitalizing the Resident Evil franchise through remakes, I'd really love to see Devil May Cry 2 get a full do-over, which would allow for some of the really potentially interesting aspects like Lucia to fully shine. But until that point, yeah, don't go near this with a 40-foot pole. Anyway, gentlemen, I have been Chucky Prophet, and it has been a pleasure. I'll see you in the next one, lads. Toodaloo.